Alright, what's going on everyone? Today I'm going to show you how to upgrade the Chandra Fury Planeswalker Deck. As always, do keep in mind that these are not intended to be tier 1 competitive decks. If you want that, consider checking out the latest tournament results. What we'll be doing is upgrading this deck card by card, sticking to this deck's themes, and doing it on a budget as we will not exceed the retail price of these decks with our upgrade. Also, 2 quick notes, as I've been saying, if you want the most competitive deck you can possibly get out of the box, I highly recommend the Challenger decks because they're amazing. I'll leave links in the description to those. Also note that Standard is rotating in a few months of this video's release. While the cards in this deck are legal, just be careful about spending too much money on a Standard deck because rotation is incoming. So anyway, the Chandra Fury Planeswalker deck is a mono red deck with a really interesting theme. It plays 2 creatures that take advantage of doing non-combat damage. Chandra's Spitfire gets +3/+0, which is pretty dangerous on a flyer, and Wildfire Elemental gives all of our creatures +1/+0 whenever we deal non-combat damage. Then the deck has some repeatable sources of non-combat damage in the form of things like Scorched Spitter and Pyroclastic Elemental. The Spitter deals 1 point of damage whenever it attacks, and the Elemental can be activated to ping the opponent for 1. So if you attack with the Scorched Spitter, for example, along with the Spitfire, the Spitter will ping the opponent for 1, which is indeed non-combat damage. Combat damage is the creature dealing damage based on its power to whatever it's attacking. This is a triggered ability that, yes, it technically happens during the combat step, but it's a triggered ability, not combat damage. And that will then trigger Spitfire, turning it into a 4/3. So basically you deal 6 damage with these 2 if you can attack and the Spitter goes unblocked. Now it would be easy to look at this and think that the upgrade path would be to move into Gutter Snipe and Electrostatic Field, but those trigger when we cast spells, and Wildfire Elemental really wants us to go wide with creatures. So we don't want to cast spells that deal non-combat damage, but rather play creatures that help us create these triggers, like Scorched Spitter and Pyroclastic Elemental that come with the deck. So basically we're just going to be upgrading these. We're going to be finding better ways to trigger the elementals that come with the deck. And before we get started, a really quick note, I'm also going to show you how to upgrade this to a very competitive mono red deck. I'll be doing that later in the video. So there's basically 2 upgrade paths with this. We can stick to the deck's themes, which I usually do with this video, but if you want to abandon the Spitfire and the Wildfire Elemental, then I'll show you how to move out of that strategy and into just a more mono red aggro build, but we'll get to that later. Alright, so first off we're going to take out the Scorched Spitters and replace them with 3 Spear Spewers. So the problem with the Spitter is it triggers on attacking, but since it's only a 1/1, it's going to have a really tough time surviving that attack. It's basically just going to get blocked and killed the first time it attacks, most of the time. The Goblins, on the other hand, can be activated every single turn, and even though they do deal damage to us as well, they deal damage equally, so it's kind of balanced, but they also trigger our elementals, so it's just a lot more consistent for our strategy, even if it's a little less explosive. I mean, the Scorched Spitter's fun if you can attack with it and Spitfire, deal a point of damage, buff up the Spitfire, but you know, it's just, you can only really do that once, maybe twice if you're lucky, but you know, it's gonna be chump blocked and be killed pretty much every single time. So having something that can just tap, deal a point of damage to trigger the elementals every single turn is exactly what we need in this deck. So I am going with the Spear Spewers. I think they're a lot more reliable. Also, I don't know why there's so many Spitters and Spitfires and Spewers. Yeah, we're just gonna move on. Next, we're gonna take out all 4 of the Pack Mastiffs for 4 copies of Fiashino Pyromancer. The problem with the Pooches is they do literally nothing for our strategy. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm sure they're good boys and all of that, but there just isn't any synergy here. The Pyromancers, on the other hand, are great because when they enter the battlefield, they pop our opponent for 2 damage, thus triggering the Spitfire and the Wildfire Elemental. If we have a Spitfire in play, the Pyromancer basically represents 5 damage to the face since it's dealing 2 damage by itself and also giving the Elemental +3/+0. So that's pretty explosive actually. For something that's just a 2 mana 2/1, being able to basically deal 5 damage which is a quarter of our opponent's life total, is pretty cool. So definitely better than the hounds, even if they're, you know, kind of adorable in a tear your face off kind of way. Next, we're taking out 2 Infuriates for 2 Skewer the Critics. So Infuriate basically gives us 3 damage for 1 mana, and Skewer the Critics basically does the same thing if we can cast it for Spectacle. The difference is we don't need a creature in play to get that damage. We can use that damage to blow up one of our opponent's creatures, and if we fling it at our opponent's face, it will trigger our elementals, which Infuriate doesn't do. And I will say that if you are skeptical that you can cast this with Spectacle, you can also put a couple lightning strikes in this spot instead. That's fine. Either way, it is way better than Infuriate, that's for sure. Infuriate, I don't know, it's kind of silly. You might as well just play a burn spell. Does the same thing, but it triggers the elementals, so yeah, burn spell is better than Infuriate. Next, we're gonna take out the Shivan Dragon and replace it with a Skargan Hellkite. So this is just like the Puppers. Shivan Dragon just doesn't synergize with the rest of our deck. The Hellkite, on the other hand, well, first off, it has Riot, so it can be a 4/4 with haste or a 5/5. So if we make it a 5/5, then it is the same size as the Shivan Dragon, but for 1 less mana, so that's cool. Then it has an activated ability that lets us deal 2 damage divided as we choose, so long as we choose to put a +1/+1 counter on it. So the fire breathing on the Shivan Dragon is nice, but being able to deal 2 damage to the opponent, or 1 damage to them and 1 damage to one of their creatures, and then trigger our elementals can be way more explosive. I mean, imagine having multiple Spitfires. You could deal 2 damage to the opponent and then have 13 flying damage ready to send at your opponent. So yeah, that's pretty crazy and definitely a big upgrade for sure. I mean, it's a consistent, reliable way to deal damage to the opponent, which is what we want, and it's still a 5 mana 5/5 with flying, so we still have a pretty hefty body, much like the Shivan Dragon. So pretty cool. Next, we're going to be taking out 2 Pyroclastic Elementals for 2 Siege Gang Commanders. Now, the Elemental is in the deck for one reason and one reason only. It's a repeatable way to deal non-combat damage to the opponent. The Commanders also fill that role, but it's a little bit more explosive. So when it enters the battlefield, we get 3 1/1 tokens, and then we can start sacrificing those tokens to deal 2 damage to the opponent, or to their creatures if necessary, but 2 damage to the opponent for 2 mana as we churn through those tokens and basically just fling them at our opponent's face. And much like the Pyromancer earlier, this basically represents 5 damage if we have a single Spitfire. So it's pretty cool. And the other thing is the fact that it allows us to go wide with Wildfire Elemental. This elemental gives all of our creatures +1/+0 when we deal non-combat damage, but the deck doesn't really have a lot of ways to really take advantage of that. I mean, it wants us to go super wide and have a bunch of creatures in play, but it's kind of like this awkward thing where how do we get a lot of creatures in play? And this does it for us. Siege Gang Commander is not only super explosive with Spitfire Elemental, basically allowing us to pay 2 to deal 5 damage, but it also gives us a ton of creatures to soak up that buff effect from the Wildfire Elemental. Pretty cool. The deck does come with 3 Pyroclastic Elementals, and I'm leaving one in because if our opponent can wipe out our tokens, then we could potentially gas out. So having a sturdier option floating around in the deck is nice, although you could, if you wanted to, convert that 3rd Pyroclastic Elemental into a 2nd Skargan Hellkite. It's not 100% necessary, but if you compare them side by side, the dragon is great. They're both 5 mana, but the dragon is going to be a 5/5 with flying instead of a 5/4 without flying with the elemental. And even though the dragon costs 1 more to activate, you also get 1 extra damage from it, and you get to divide it, so if you want to ping off a small creature, that's cool too. And the flying is definitely noteworthy because that can end games. So yeah, I would say that's a perfectly fair trade. If you want to take out that 3rd Pyroclastic Elemental for another Skargan Hellkite, yeah, have at it, man. Totally worth it if you want to spend the extra couple of dollars. And that's actually all of our upgrades. While we powered this thing up quite a bit, one of its greatest weaknesses is this strategy is a little janky, which you can actually fix if you want to. The problem is, what happens if you draw your elementals but no ways to trigger them? Or what if you draw all of your enablers but no elementals to take advantage of them? That's the danger of a deck like this. Because we're so split, we need this like perfect ratio of elementals and enablers that you do run the risk of drawing, too many of one or too many of the other. And that's just how janky decks work. They're usually fun and kind of crazy, but they can be a little unreliable. And this deck, I feel like it does very much qualify as janky. So if you want to convert to just like a very solid mono red aggro deck that isn't super reliant on having a very specific ratio of cards, here's how to do it. We're going to be super quick here, just a really quick upgrade guide. Let's do it. First off, you're going to take out the spitters and replace them with fanatical firebrands. Much like the spitters, these die when we deal the 1 damage, but we have much more control over where that damage goes, and the fact that it has haste is super nice because we can basically play it as a sorcery speed burn spell to kill anything with 1 toughness. Alternatively, we can play it on turn 1 and start attacking right away, which is nice. So yeah, lots of cool things with that. We're also going to take out the 4 puppers for the 4 pyromancers, which is the same thing we did in the last version of the deck, so I have nothing to say here. We're also going to take out the wildfire elementals for goblin chain whirlers. The elementals are a little clunky, and the chain whirlers are kind of great, functioning as a mini board wipe and also giving us a pretty hefty body on the battlefield. The first strike is actually super relevant and is kind of a nightmare for the opponent, and this card is actually pretty decent in the previous version as well because it does deal 1 damage to the opponent, so it does trigger our elementals. I just didn't know how to fit it in, but if you have those, you could probably go down the wildfire elementals for these or something, I don't know. Next, we're going to take out all of the expensive crap for Runaway Steamkin because all of this stuff is too expensive, and Runaway Steamkin is amazing, getting a +1/+1 counter whenever we cast a red spell. It can be a 4/4 for 2 mana, and it can also give us tons of mana to spam burn spells, so that's fun. And now that we've cut out all of the expensive stuff, we can cut 3 mountains. Yes, 3 mountains for 3 Skewer the Critics. This is just a byproduct of lowering the mana curve. Less expensive cards means less lands required for the deck to work. Next, we're going to take out Pyroclastic Elemental for Experimental Frenzy, which lets us combo kill our opponent by ripping off a bunch of burn spells in a single turn and winning unexpectedly. Also works really well with Runaway Steamkin, so there's that. We're also going to take out the other 2 elementals for 1 each of Fanatical Firebrand and get to Lava Runner because the elementals are too expensive and we want to be aggressive. For the same reason, we'll take out 2 Flame Waves, which don't do anything without Chandra, and replace them with Lightning Strike because they're cheaper and faster. We'll also take out 2 Infuriates for 2 more Lightning Strike because Infuriate is not good. And then finally, we'll take out 2 more mountains. Yep, 2 more mountains for 2 more get to Lava Runners because at this point we have basically nothing expensive in the deck at all, so we can trim a ton of the lands out for more aggressive creatures. And at that point, we basically have an entirely different deck with almost none of the original cards, and yet we're still pretty low on the budget. You definitely don't have to go this route since it's an entirely different deck, and if you do want to go this route, then you don't even need to start with this deck because we basically have none of the original cards. So yeah. Anyway, we didn't really have cards that were too expensive for this deck this time around, except for maybe Light Up the Stage, which is really good, but I don't think it's quite as good in this deck since so many of our cards are so expensive to cast, though it is one of the cards that's missing from the second deck. So if you built that, then yeah, Light Up the Stage is one of the cards that we couldn't afford. I'll leave a link in the description, by the way, to just a regular standard mono red aggro deck. I mean, literally a tier 1 mono red deck right now is like $50 to $60, which isn't very much. So yeah, it's pretty cheap actually to play mono red competitively. Pretty cool. I'll leave a link to that if you want to check it out. So yeah, I think that's it. Regardless of which deck you upgraded into, I think we have a much more powerful deck than when we started. So hopefully that helps you burn your opponents to a crisp. If you like these Planeswalker deck upgrade videos and want to see more of them, I have an entire playlist dedicated to them, and you can find a link to it in the description below. You'll also find my Amazon affiliate link there. Literally anything you buy after clicking that link, magic related or not, helps me buy expensive crap I need to produce videos, and it doesn't cost you any extra, so it's a free way to show your support, and I appreciate it. Also consider subscribing for more upgrade guides in the future, but in the meantime, thanks for watching. I hope this video was helpful, and I will see you in the next one.